Failure? No, just temporary setbacks. Gonna have an inspirational story for you on Coffee with Alain. So appreciate everybody that joins and listens and comments and listens to replays or the podcast. Thank you to all of you. You know, I'm drinking out of the influence of a good teacher can never be erased mug, because we're going to talk about a teacher and the influence there. And I want to share a little story. And the story is coming from this very first Chicken Soup of the Soul book. You know, I read this a number of years ago, and then I reread it just recently as I'm downsizing my library. And there was a story in this that caught me off guard when I first read it, and reading it again reminded me as well, because it has a little bit special meaning to me. And that's why I want to read that story for you and share that as an inspirational message. And then I'll share why it had more importance to me. Failure? No, just temporary setbacks. If you could come to my office in California to visit with me today, you would notice across one side of the room a beautiful old-fashioned Spanish tile and mahogany soda fountain with 9 leather-covered stools, the kind they used to have in the old drugstores. Unusual? Yes. But if those stools could speak, they would tell you a story about the day I almost lost hope and gave up. It was a recession period after World War II, and jobs were scarce. Cowboy Bob, my husband, had purchased a small dry cleaning business with borrowed money. We had 2 darling babies, a tract home, a car, and all the usual time payments. Then the bottom fell out. There was no money for the house payments or anything else. I felt that I had no special talent, no training, no college education. I didn't think much of myself, but I remembered someone in my past who thought I had a little ability. My Alhambra High School English teacher. She inspired me to take journalism and named me advertising manager and feature editor of the school paper. I thought, now if I could write a shopper's column for the small weekly newspaper in our rural town, maybe I could earn that house payment. I had no car and no babysitter, so I pushed my 2 children before me in a rickety baby stroller with a big pillow tied in the back. The wheel kept coming off, but I hit it back on with the heel of my shoe and kept going. I was determined that my children would not lose their home as I had often done as a child. But at the newspaper office, there were no jobs available. Recession. So I caught an idea. I asked if I might buy advertising space at wholesale and sell it at retail as a shopper's column. They agreed, telling me later that they mentally gave me about a week of pushing that beat-up, heavily laden stroller down those country roads before I gave up. But they were wrong. The newspaper column idea worked. I made enough money for the house payment and to buy an old used car that Cowboy Bob found for me. Then I hired a high school girl to babysit from 3 to 5 each afternoon. When the clock struck 3, I grabbed my newspaper samples and flew out of the door to drive to my appointments. But on one dark, rainy afternoon, every advertising prospect I had worked on turned me down when I went to pick up their copy. Why? I asked. They said they had noticed that Reuben Allman, the president of the Chamber of Commerce and the owner of the Rexall drugstore, did not advertise with me. His store was the most popular in town. They respected his judgment. There must be something wrong with your advertising, they explained. My heart sank. Those 4 ads would have made the house payment. Then I thought, I will try to speak with Mr. Allman one more time. Everyone loves and respects him. Surely he will listen. Every time I had tried to approach him in the past, he had refused to see me. He was always out or unavailable. I knew that if he advertised with me, the other merchants in town would follow his lead. This time, as I walked into the Rexall drugstore, He was there at the prescription counter in the back. I smiled my best smile and held up my precious shopper's column carefully marked in my children's green Crayola. I said, "Everyone respects your opinion, Mr. Allman. Would you just look at my work for a moment so that I can tell the other merchants what you think?" His mouth turned perpendicular in an upside down U. Without saying a word, he emphatically shook his head in a chilling negative gesture. No. My knotted heart fell to the floor with such a thud. I thought everyone must have heard it. Suddenly, all of my enthusiasm left me. I made it as far as the beautiful old soda fountain at the front of the drugstore, feeling that I didn't have the strength to drive home. I didn't want to sit at the soda fountain without buying something, so I pulled out my last dime and ordered a cherry Coke. I wondered desperately what to do. Would my babies lose their home as I had so many times when I was growing up? Was my journalism teacher wrong? Maybe that talent she talked about was just a dud. My eyes filled with tears. A soft voice beside me on the next soda fountain stool said, "What's the matter, dear?" I looked into the sympathetic face of a lovely gray-haired lady. I poured out my story to her, ending it with, "But Mr. Allman, who everyone respects so much, will not look at my work." "Let me see that shopper's column," she said. She took my marked issue of the newspaper in her hands and carefully read it all the way through. Then she spun around on the stool, stood up, looked back at the prescription counter, and in a commanding voice that could be heard down the block said, "Reuben Allman, come here." The lady was Mrs. Allman. She told Reuben to buy the advertising from me. His mouth turned up the other way in a big grin. Then she asked me for the names of the 4 merchants who had turned me down. She went to the phone and called each one. She gave me a hug and told me they were waiting for me and to go back and pick up their ads. Reuben and Vivian Allman became our dear friends, as well as steady advertising customers. I learned that Reuben was a darling man who bought from everyone. He had promised Vivian not to buy any more advertising. He was just trying to keep his word to her. If I had only asked others in town, I might have learned that I should have been talking to Mrs. Allman from the beginning. That conversation on the stools of the soda fountain was the turning point. My advertising business prospered and grew into 4 offices with 285 employees serving 4,000 continuous contract advertising accounts. Later, when Mr. Allman modernized the old drugstore and removed the soda fountain, my sweet husband Bob bought it and installed it in my office. If you were here in California, we would sit on the soda fountain stools together. I'd pour you a cherry Coke and remind you never give up, to remember that help is always closer than we know. Then I would tell you that if you can't communicate with a key person, search for more information. Try another path around. Look for someone who can communicate for you in a third-person endorsement. And finally, I would serve you these sparkling, refreshing words of Bill Marriott of the Marriott Hotels. Failure? I never encountered it. All I ever met were temporary setbacks. That's by Dottie Walters. And when I read that originally in this book, and it started out, "If you could come to my office in California to visit with me today, you would notice across one side of the room a beautiful old-fashioned Spanish tile and mahogany soda fountain with 9 leather-covered stools." And how she ended, "If you were here in California, we'd sit there, have a cherry Coke, and she'd remind you about things." I read that story and thought, wow. And the reason is, reading it here is not the first time I heard that story. The first time I heard that story was sitting on one of those stools, beside that soda fountain with Dottie and a couple others, and she shared that story with us. I don't remember if we were drinking cherry Coke. We were drinking refreshments. We had some snacks and refreshments. It was a small group of us, 3 or 4, and Dottie, and she told that story. And so that was the first time I heard that story, was right from her, sitting at that soda fountain in her offices, which her office is beside her home, is connected to her home, or it was in California. She has passed away since then. And I remember that day, she autographed this book for me, To Alain with every good wish for your paid speaking career, Dottie Walters, signed in there by her. But it's a great story. It's a great lesson. It was a great lesson when she told it to us in person. It's a great lesson in this book. And so I wanted to share it with you. Failures are just temporary setbacks. Find a different way. I want to say good morning to a couple people. Phil is here. Phil says, when we know what and why we want and stifle the how, take committed action makes things happen. Yep, the committed action, so important. Thad said, good morning. Good morning, Thad. Appreciate you being here. Phil had also said, I've always liked that story. Haven't heard it in a while. And then Phil said, wow, how cool is that being there with her? It was very cool. And, the funny thing is, in that story, she talked about pushing her babies. Well, I met Lily as well, Dottie's daughter, who is also an author, and she was there as well. So I got to meet her. She was one of the babies in the early story, and obviously a grown woman at the time that I met her. It was when I was living in California, after Japan, before Korea. So that would have been around 1995 that I met Dottie at her office. And there were, like I said, there were a few of us there for a seminar, a speaking seminar, a paid speaking seminar. And we sat at that soda fountain and she shared that story. And it was extremely motivating and inspirational when she told it. It's still inspirational reading it out of this book, which is, as I said yesterday, filled with a lot of great stories and inspiration. And that's why I do like these books and recommend them. If you want some uplifting, motivational, inspirational tales, those books are full of them. Appreciate everybody here. Phil also said, fail, first attempt in learning. Exactly. Dixon said, very inspirational. Thanks. Appreciate all of you guys being here. Appreciate everybody else that listens. I'm going to sign off so I can get this posted up to the podcast for all you podcast listeners. Hope you enjoy it as well. Then I'm going to get busy to finish up the newsletter. The newsletter goes out tonight. If you're not on the list, enjoylifesafely.com. You can get on that list and learn a whole bunch of stuff on staying safe, enjoying life, and being exceptional, because that's what we're about at enjoylifesafely.com. That's what we're about here at Coffee with Alain. Everybody, make it a sensational Sunday. I'll see you tomorrow.